In wilds beyond they speak your name with reverence and regret, for none could tame our savage souls, yet you the challenge met. Under palest watch you taught, we changed, base instincts were redeemed, a world you gave to bug and beast, as they had never dreamed. So, this is the text that greets you when you first start up the game Hollow Knight. One of my commenters recently suggested I take a look at it, what with the recent release of Hollow Knight's sequel, Silksong. However, these 4 lines are not actually the entirety of the poem. This Reddit post from user Erasmus allegedly shows the poem's full text, as discovered in the game's files. As someone who knows very little about Hollow Knight, I thought it would be a fun exercise to analyze and critique this poem separate from the game's context. Then, after that, I'll do some research on the game and we'll see what new meaning it takes on once I know what the average player might know. If you've seen me do in-depth analyses of poetry on this channel before, you know I favor the tips fast method. That stands for title, paraphrase, speaker, figurative language, attitude, shifts, title revisited, and theme or meaning of the work. If you've been in a high school English classroom, you're probably familiar with either this method or a similar one. But before we get into that, let's do a single read-through of the poem, just so we have a general idea of what we're working with before we really dig into the weeds. Ode to Hallownest. In wilds beyond they speak your name with reverence and regret, for none could tame our savage souls, yet you the challenge met. Under palest watch you taught, you changed, base instincts were redeemed, a world you gave to bug and beast, as they had never dreamed. Our cherished dreams you granted and delivered more, but in dismay you found too late our desires had no end. What cost to tame our savagery, you gave your all and then gave more, yet still desires lay unquenched, more dreams remained, your energies spent. Amongst it sprang a dreadful scourge that forced return our aggressive urge, and turned us back to beasts or husks, our souls consumed by light above. Within your corpse can still be heard the plaintive cries of one who took our pain and loss and dreams inside itself too. Through its pain we found a truth that must now be confessed, for nothing can contain such things but perfect emptiness. We'll get into my thoughts on the poem's quality later. For now, I just want to analyze it. So, starting with the title, we have Ode to Hallownest. I'm certainly no expert, but I would imagine Hallownest is likely a place just based on its name. It could also very well be a person or some other proper noun, so we'll look out for further clues as we keep reading through. As for Ode, the Poetry Foundation can help us with that one. A formal, often ceremonious lyric poem that addresses and often celebrates a person, place, thing, or idea. Its stanza forms vary. There you go, that's about all there is to it. But notably, while the Reddit post calls the poem Ode to Hallownest, the game calls it Elegy for Hallownest, which is different. To cite the Poetry Foundation again, in traditional English poetry, an elegy is often a melancholy poem that laments its subject's death but ends in consolation. In the 18th century, the elegiac stanza emerged, though its use has not been exclusive to elegies. Elegiac stanza is a quatrain with the rhyme scheme AB and written in iambic pentameter. Now, notably, the poem here doesn't follow the elegiac stanza pattern, but it still fits the parameters of an elegy in the sense that it's a melancholic poem lamenting a subject's death, or so it seems at first. Next, we paraphrase to understand what's happening literally on the face of the poem. Here's my attempt at a line-by-line paraphrase. In faraway lands, they talk about you with both respect and shame. Nobody could rid us of our monstrousness, but you gave it a try. Even into late hours of the night, you taught us and changed us to something redeemable. And you gave us a world beyond what we could have imagined. You helped us make our dreams come true and more, but you were upset to find we weren't satisfied. You gave everything to help us, and it wasn't enough. What more could you do? We had more wants than you were physically able to fulfill. And amid this turmoil, terribleness came about, and we reverted to our worst selves, something like monsters or empty shells. Our souls were eaten up in a greater light. But your dead body still cries. We still hear it, the cries of someone who sacrificed everything for us. Through the pain of this dead body, we now have to admit, only emptiness can hold pain, loss, and dreams. So you'll notice with my paraphrase that I basically just used a lot of synonyms or just ripped the words straight from the poem in some cases. Like I said, the point of the paraphrase is to understand what's literally happening in the poem. Some words didn't need to be replaced in order to make that happen for me. Whatever you need from your paraphrase, make it happen. As for the speaker, the game tells us that the author of this poem is Manamon the teacher. Almost read that as Mormon the teacher, but anyway. What's important is that you really should never call the author of a poem its speaker. The speaker is a distinct persona from the author, no matter how autobiographical the poem seems. For this poem, we really don't know much about the speaker, but given their use of plural possessive pronouns, it's clear they're part of the group that the subject helped in this piece, which makes the lament all too personal. Moving on to figurative language. This should be the most substantive part of the analysis, since, in general, poems are kind of just big clusters of figurative language. But for the sake of time, I'll just highlight some of the most meaningful instances of figurative language from my point of view. I would love to hear others that you all might notice. One thing that jumps out are some of the subtle pieces of alliteration. Reverence and regret, savage souls, bug and beast. These instances help the sound of the poem quite a bit, in my opinion. In the third line, we have the phrase, under palest watch, which you may have noticed me paraphrase as, even into the late hours of the night. That's what I believe the line is getting at. I think this is a figurative way of saying that the subject of the poem worked even under the pale light of the moon, that is, day and night, morning and evening, all hours. They were tirelessly devoted to their cause. I also want to highlight the phrase, you changed, on this line, because it would be easy to read that as, you yourself changed, when it probably means, you changed us, which I think is neat. The next 4 lines don't really have any figurative language I wanted to point out. Again, if you want to bring up something here, please do, but I want to jump to the end of the third stanza. So in this stanza, the subject of the poem has basically failed, and as such, the speaker and their people reverted back to their savage forms. But the last line says, our souls consumed by light above, which is super interesting to me. On its face, I would probably initially think that everyone in the poem just died. To say their souls were consumed by light above sounds like a pretty clear euphemism for dying. They went to the afterlife, right? But the word husks in the previous line makes me think otherwise. I think we're literally supposed to understand that these people's souls left their bodies and they remained more or less as zombies or otherwise irredeemable living beings. In our last stanza, we have the metaphor of a corpse, a dead body, that can still cry out from within. This visual feels like another example of what I was just talking about, bodies that don't have souls. The corpse remains and can even still cry the same way a living person can, but it's not a living person. The use of the word plaintiff is also really interesting. We know that in the legal sense, a plaintiff is someone who brings a case or evidence against someone. Here in the poem, the word suggests to me that the subject's existence and death stands as a case or evidence against the speaker and their people. As for our last line, I assume such things refers to the pain, loss, and dreams referred to in the second line of this stanza. Now, pain and loss are obviously bad things on paper, but dreams? Not so much. Remember the Poetry Foundation's definition of elegy? How elegies usually end with a consolation? I do feel there is at least an ounce of hope there. Like, yeah, everyone might be empty and hollow, husks, as the poem says, and yet there's potential in emptiness, isn't there? But I'm getting ahead of myself. This is also where we would want to touch on the meter, rhyme scheme, and structure. As far as structure goes, I've actually seen sort of conflicting versions of this poem. Remember, this was found in the game's files, it wasn't really meant to be seen in its entirety, so I'm not sure, and I don't know if anyone is sure as to whether this poem has stanza breaks or not. I thought it looked and read much better with stanza breaks, so I opted for that, but ultimately I won't touch much more on the structure. The meter and rhyme scheme shift a lot in this poem, so we'll talk about that more when we get into the shifts section of our analysis. Moving on to attitude, well, we kind of already know just based on the title. Melancholic, but with an ounce of hope and consolation. If we wanted to say more, the poem itself actually offers some decent words. The one that jumps out to me the most is regret. I would say regretful describes the tone very well. And that'll take us into the shifts. The first stanza offers a rhythm that feels mostly pretty consistent along with an AABB rhyme scheme. But the piece throws that out on the second stanza. The changes in meter and rhyme scheme signal a lot of the changes happening within the text. In the first stanza, the subject helps the people reach redemption. In the second stanza, the people start desiring too much. In the third stanza, they revert back to their savage forms. And in the fourth stanza, they become something else entirely. The poem also signals a lot of its shifts with words like but and yet. When you see these words in a poem, make sure you pay attention to them. Revisiting the title, I'm actually going to walk back my initial thought that Hallownest is a place. It certainly could be, but it sounds more like a person, the person who sacrificed so much for the people and ultimately couldn't save them. Which takes us to the theme or the meaning of the work. There are a couple of acceptable themes we could pull from the piece. Here are just a few that came to mind. A do-gooder's cause is never lost. Their influence is always felt, even when it seems they failed. Redemption is always possible. And perhaps most prominent in my mind, there is potential in loss and emptiness. It reminds me of this quote attributed to Lao Tzu: "We shape clay into a pot, but it is the emptiness inside that holds whatever we want." So even though that concludes our analysis here, there is one more thing I wanted to mention. Frankly, I probably should have put this on the figurative language portion of the explication, but whatever, I'm sure you guys will still follow, you're all smart. If I came across this poem in the wild, if I had no idea it came from Hallownest or from anything at all, if I were led to believe it was just some poem by some author, I would probably 100% think it's a poem about Jesus Christ, or maybe some other sacrificial religious figure. And heck, maybe the folks at Team Cherry absolutely did intend a biblical allusion when writing this poem and this story. After all, just take a look at some of the language here. "For none could tame our savage souls" reminds me of the fall of Adam and Eve and how that sin would be swallowed up in Jesus' sacrifice. Then, base instincts were redeemed. Redeemed on its own is a very religiously charged word, similar to the word delivered on the first line of the second stanza. And on the next line, "a world you gave," one could literally interpret that as God the Father, or God the Son, depending on the theology, creating the world. In the stanzas after that, we have what sounds like a metaphorical retelling of Jesus being betrayed and crucified by his own people, ultimately sacrificing himself, spending his energy, ergo giving his life. And with the loss of Christ, the people reverted to their aggressive urge. What's more, the dreadful scourge line also kind of reminds me of the darkness that followed Jesus' death. And then the ending sort of feels like the resurrection, where Jesus died but didn't actually die, instead becoming perfect and giving everyone in life a second chance. A buddy of mine actually told me some of Hallownest's big ideas revolve around religion. You may think I'm reaching here, and sure, that might be the case. I honestly feel sort of conditioned to look for biblical allusions in the literature I read. In Thomas C. Foster's How to Read Literature Like a Professor, Chapter 5 is titled, "When in Doubt, It's from Shakespeare," and Chapter 6 is titled, "Or the Bible." But regardless of whether the biblical allusion is intended or not, I would argue it still supports the themes I picked out. A do-gooder's cause is never lost, their influence is always felt, even when it seems they failed, redemption is always possible, and there is potential in loss and emptiness. If the poem were further in dialogue with the story of Jesus, then the theme might be a little different, but since the allusion simply seems to reinforce the original story rather than responding to anything, I think my reading holds up. Nevertheless, I'd be interested to hear from all of you. Did you interpret the poem differently? Let me know. Before we talk about what the poem might mean in the context of the game, I do want to take a second to critique it. What can this poem teach us about how to write better poetry? But again, we have to keep in mind that this was never meant to be seen in its entirety. In fact, the third to last line reads as completely unfinished, with the ellipses serving as a placeholder for a word they'd decide on later. So I'm not engaging in this critique to say Team Cherry did an awful job with this or whatever. No, that's not the point, and that would be pretty disingenuous anyway. Again, it's just an exercise for our own edification. I mentioned earlier how I wanted to touch on the rhythm and rhyme a bit more. This first stanza is, in my mind, almost perfect in its construction. So, brief lesson in poetic rhythm. Lines in poetry are made up of metrical feet. Feet are the building blocks of meter. You probably remember the phrase iambic pentameter from high school. An iamb is a type of metrical foot, and it just means that there are two syllables, the first one unstressed, the second one stressed. The word pentameter tells us how many feet there are, the prefix pent meaning 5, so iambic pentameter means 10 syllables total in a pattern of unstressed and stressed. As an aside, I had a commenter recently say they'd like to see a video about poetic rhythm in general. Let me know if that's something you'd be interested in. In the first line of Ode to Hallownest, we have a line that is iambic heptameter. That means 7 iambs, 14 syllables. I'll read it with an emphasis on each stressed syllable. "In wilds beyond they speak your name with reverence and regret." Doesn't that just have a great sound to it, especially with that alliteration I mentioned earlier? The next line carries on with the same meter. "For none could tame our savage souls, yet you the challenge met." So the rhythmic consistency is on point, and as a bonus, we get a pretty good rhyme in there with regret and met. But the third line isn't quite iambic heptameter. Notice that it begins with a stressed syllable and has 15 syllables total. "Under palest watch you taught, you changed, base instincts were redeemed." We could clean this up by writing it like this, for example. For under palest watch you taught, base instincts were redeemed. But this is just an example. I wouldn't go for exactly this, seeing as the last line also started with the word for, and that would make for unnecessary repetition. Also, I really do like how this line uses taught and changed. I like the emphasis in the difference between those two, but it's hard to keep them both in when working with 14 syllables per line. Still, there would for sure be a way to do it. And then the last line of the stanza reverts back to perfect iambic heptameter. A world you gave to bug and beast as they had never dreamed. So for the most part, this stanza is really consistent, and you can feel that great sound even if you're not familiar with meter or formal rhythm in poetry. But after that first stanza, the rhythm just kind of seems to get away from the poem. I can see how the structural shifts emphasize the changing plot, but honestly, I think the poem on the whole would have been stronger if it were all in iambic heptameter. And I'm not saying all poems in general have to remain totally consistent all throughout. Even Shakespeare shook up his formula a lot. But sometimes when a reader comes across multiple untelegraphed shifts, that can be confusing and frustrating. In a poem like this, an ode or elegy, I personally think a consistent rhythm and rhyme really tend to strengthen the message. The third stanza almost comes back to something consistent, but the second line is off in a similar way to how the third line in the first stanza was off. The shifts in rhyme scheme are sort of equally frustrating, but again, I kind of chalk that up to the poem being unfinished. Still, going from AABB in the first stanza to, I think, CDCD is a little weird, especially once we go back to EEFF in the next stanza. I assume the final stanza's second line would have rhymed with its first, but who can say? For all its weaknesses, I do think confessed emptiness is a pretty killer couplet to end on. I probably would have gotten rid of 4 on the last line, again to keep the rhythm consistent with the previous line, plus we already had a line that started with 4. And to that point, there are a lot of repeated words in this poem. Dream is the one that stands out the most, for sure. Regular viewers of mine will know that I don't love repetition in general, and in cases such as these where it's not necessarily an intentional refrain, I find myself thinking English is such a diverse language. I think any author can find synonyms to keep the momentum going where required. One last thing I wanted to mention is some of the indeterminate language in this poem, like the word it on the first line of the third stanza, and the words such things in the last line of the poem. I think in general you want to avoid language like this in writing because it's too vague. If you've watched my second channel videos, you've probably heard me say this before. Avoid words like it, this, that, and something. For my taste, they're just too vague. They generally won't give the audience any satisfaction. My advisor in my MFA program recently told me that readers have an attention budget. If you confuse them with words like it and such things, or even force them to go looking for antecedents, that might very well spend their attention budget. Like, I'm not totally sure what it refers to in the third stanza. In the last stanza, I assume such things refers to the pain and loss and dreams in the second line here, but I still can't say with total certainty. Which is a shame, to be honest. I hope you learned something from that. Again, I'd love to hear all of your thoughts. With all that in mind, let's talk about what the poem might mean in the context of the game. Wow, this stuff is complicated. I watched this video from Mossbag about the game's lore, and even he emphasizes that a lot of the supposed lore behind Hollow Knight is pure speculation. Also, this video is like 5 years old now, so it might not even be up to date, but here's what I can glean from this video, and if it wasn't obvious, some spoilers for Hollow Knight are imminent beyond this point. I was right the first time. Hallownest is a place, not a person. It's a place made up of factions of bugs, and each of these factions has their own god or object of worship, or in some cases there is no being of worship. There's also an extinct race of bugs called worms, spelled like the dragon and not like earthworms, and one of the carcasses of these worms still exists in Hallownest. However, inside this carcass, an egg hatched, creating a being known as the Pale King. The Pale King is the one who established Hallownest as we know it in the game. In the video, Mossbag references the poem at the beginning of the game, confirming that the Pale King is the one who essentially tamed the bugs, helped them overcome their savagery, and gave them higher thought. According to Mossbag, Hallownest's citizens literally believed the Pale King created the world and everything in it. Words like soul and dream also have specific meanings within the world of Hollow Knight, distinct from how we read and understand these words. Soul is sort of life force that animates all of the living creatures' bodies. Some bugs also believe in a dream world, which is a higher plane of existence, and dreams themselves are, I guess, magic? I'm sorry if I'm butchering this explanation, like I said, it's complicated. But anyhow, eventually the bugs of Hallownest became complacent with their comfort, as Mossbag puts it. In fact, the upper echelons of the society became especially cowardly. What's more, the Hallow King and his subjects developed quite a bit of hubris, declaring Hallownest to be the last civilization. Kinda reminds me of the whole "the sun will never set on the British Empire" thing, or any other example of great civilizations that fell, like the Roman Empire. Hallownest did eventually fall to a force called the Radiance, which began appearing in Bugs' dreams and ultimately afflicted them in the waking world, taking over their minds. But with his kingdom on the brink of collapse, the Pale King devised a way to eventually get the upper hand. He used a substance called Void to create a new race of creatures, Vessels. The Pale King and a figure called the White Lady had a bunch of eggs together, and the king let the Void corrupt them. The resulting vessels were not technically alive, but shells of living beings, and as such they couldn't be corrupted by the radiance. Of all the vessels, one was chosen to be the Hollow Knight. Meanwhile, the protagonist is one of these vessels who escaped the imminent doom the Pale King brought on all the other vessels who weren't chosen. Granted, it appears there's some debate as to whether the protagonist is truly hollow. Anyway, the Pale King eventually left for the dream world, where he died. With all that context in mind, certain lines do take on at least a slightly different meaning. Wilds Beyond literally refers to the wilds outside Hallownest. In fact, the entire first stanza is more literal than it seems, with savage souls not being an exaggeration at all. And Under Palest Watch is a pretty explicit reference to the Pale King, not just a fanciful way of saying things take place at night. Also, Bug and Beast isn't just a fanciful way of saying all creatures in the land, but a literal reference to all the bugs, the primary living things in Hallownest. In the second stanza, we don't even totally need the context to understand this one, but it's describing how the bugs became rich, greedy, and cowardly. In the third stanza, when it says, "our souls consumed by light above," that too is quite literal, a reference to the radiance and the infection it spread among the bugs. I've seen some people theorize that the Hollow Knight universe is just a poetic, epic imagining of what happens in bug ecosystems underground, and the radiance is just a stand-in for the actual sun. Like, yeah, it certainly would rock a bug ecosystem if their ground was messed up and they were subjected to the sun. It's really interesting because in most contexts, our souls consumed by light above would probably have a very positive connotation. Like, yeah, the word consumed can perhaps have a negative connotation, but like I said in my analysis, this line kind of sounds like a rapture, like everyone's going to heaven. But for a bunch of bugs who live in a dark underground, what a nightmare. I don't know, I just think that's neat and creative. Ultimately, it seems that the poem's end refers to the titular Hollow Knight, a vessel who is empty and therefore unafflicted by the radiance, but also unable to really process dreams or have a soul, if I'm understanding this all correctly. While analyzing like this is all cool and fun, it's actually like a little bit silly, admittedly. Like, Team Cherry never intended for the poem to undergo this treatment. Obviously, they never even really intended for us to see the poem in its entirety, but beyond that, I mean. The portion of the poem that we do see is just a fun little bit of world building, which is awesome. With all the context in mind, the poem actually kind of reads like a propaganda piece, funnily enough. If I understood the lore correctly, Monomon the teacher was handpicked by the Pale King to advise him, I think, so this very well could have been a propaganda piece for him, to glorify his greatness or whatever. And it's cool that we can speculate on it in that way. My patrons and I got to talking about original poetry in video games and how it usually exists as a means to flesh out the world, to make it feel lived in. And to Hollow Knight's credit, the world absolutely does feel lived in. The poems add to the immense history that Team Cherry developed, a history that we don't even know in its entirety. Poetry in fiction is a means of storytelling and world building. The most immediate example that always comes to mind is, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien. The poems and songs in his books really do make Middle-earth feel like a universe unto itself, a place that really does exist, with Tolkien acting as a historian, translator, and compiler of its records. We often think about poetry as an art form unto itself, but rarely as a tool for world building. It's cool to see poetry used as a vehicle for immersion, not just in Hollow Knight, but in other pieces of literature, gaming, and at large. I love it. Even if a fictional poem isn't great by our standards, it can be great or important by fictional world standards. Poetry's implementation in this way really goes to show how no civilization can go without indulging in the arts. It's delightful to think that even in fictional worlds, the inhabitants can't help but play with and explore their language. If you enjoyed this, please say so. If you'd like to see me take a look at poetry from other games, let me know. I want to hear all your thoughts on this poem, the other poetry in Hollow Knight and Silksong, and your thoughts on poetry and games overall. Please tell me everything. And hey, before you go, take a look at this poem. This is from one of my patrons, Linus Reed. The piece reads, "Frugal filaments to keep him warm. Are the words a well that we all draw from? Who sits nakedly, shivering in the dark and wet of the well, steeped into its waters up to his chest? He lets his every gesture be carried as ripples through it. He has no weight in the water at all. What a relief. It picks him up from the mercilessly cold stone floor. But the clamoring who take from his drink, they shallow the waters, and ballistic chills, the frugal filaments to keep him warm, take swiftly away in every direction. They pull him apart, then to let his heel feel on the cool stone and have his fervor be known." For the chance to submit one of your pieces at the end of my videos, you can support me on Patreon too. You'll also get access to the community Discord, early access to videos here on the main channel, and priority review for your work over on the second channel. You're seeing the names of my patrons on screen right now, and I genuinely can't thank them enough. If you want to support in non-monetary ways, please like, comment, subscribe, share, and watch my other videos. It really does help a ton. You can also follow me on my socials, but no matter what, thank you for watching. Keep reading, keep writing, and ultimately, keep in mind, this is a rough draft.